Hey programmers, welcome back. Right now let's walk through the Chapter 4 Section A exercise, and that will be about arrays, of course. So if you haven't given this exercise a shot, definitely pause this video and go to the link in the description and give it an honest go. So go ahead and do that, but for now, if you get stuck, I'll walk through all of these exercises. So in this set, we'll just have to work through a bunch of little functions, and they all have to do with arrays. So let me just get my environment set up. So I have VS Code open, and it says I should create a new folder called arrays. So let me quickly create that folder. I've done this many times before. And inside, it looks like we're going to create a file for every little problem here, right? So basically one function per file. So let me work on this first one. So I'll copy the prompt. That way I can just work inside of VS Code. Recommend you do the same. And let me create a total.js file. So I'll go right inside of this folder. So total.js, let me paste the prompt in, and yeah, let's give it a shot. So what I should do here is write a function called total that accepts an array of numbers as an argument, and the function should return the total sum of all elements in the array. So looking at the first example, looks like we want to calculate the total sum of 3 to 8. So basically 3 plus 2 is 5, plus 8 is going to be 13, and that's the number we should return. And we have very similar examples over here. Looking at maybe the last example, it's kind of an interesting case. When we're given an empty array, what is the total sum of the empty array? Well, that's definitely 0, right? Because there's nothing to really add altogether. And so let's jump right into this one. So, looking at the prompt, start with bits and pieces. Here I want to create a function. So let me go ahead and define my function, right? Nothing fancy here. So I'll call this function total, and I'll make it a function. Add my semicolon, and let's start to flesh out what this function should do, right? So let me list any arguments. So here I just take an array of numbers. I'll go ahead and call that numbers. And then from here, what I'll do is think about a strategy for solving this one. So looking at the description, if I pick out some language, I know I have to calculate a total sum. And we've done a few patterns like that before. And so I want to adopt that classic strategy by creating a variable that contains my running sum. I'm going to keep adding into that sum variable. So let me go ahead and create that. I'll say let sum, and a good initial value for this is 0, right? Because before I even look at any elements in the array, I know that my current sum is just 0. Nice. And then from here, what I should do is begin to iterate or touch every element of the input array. So don't forget how to iterate through an array. Just use a for loop that really hits every index of the array, right? So I'll say let I equals 0, go up to the length of the numbers array, and hit every index along the way. Before I go any further, let me just do a quick sanity check and just console.log numbers at index I, right? And I should just be printing out every element of the array. So let me go ahead and give this first test case a call, and I'll open up my terminal, and you should do the same. And what I'll go ahead and do is run this file, right? So I need to move my terminal around a little bit. Looks like I'm inside of the lecturing folder. And so what I should do is go inside of a array. So I'll just cd into a arrays. And now I'm right next to the total.js, right? So here I can just run this using node. So node total.js. Cool, and I see some output. So it's correctly iterating every number. So I'm getting 3 to 8, there it is. You're probably wondering, why do I see undefined at the very end? Well, if I look at the test case itself on line 11, it's gonna try to print out the return value of my function called to total. Obviously right now, if you look inside of my total function, there is no literal return line. So by default, it returns undefined. But that's okay, I'm just trying to debug things as I go. So I'm pretty certain that I'm hitting the correct numbers, right? So I'm iterating through the array left to right. And what I want to do is just take this element and just add it into the sum. And remember the trick here, right? What you want to do is actually modify the sum variable. So doing simply this, like sum plus numbers at index I, that will not actually change the sum variable. I want to kind of accumulate this running sum, so I want to reassign into it. Using the shorthand, I can say plus equals. Cool. And then after I'm done adding every number into my sum, what I want to do is just return that sum. A very important bit here is I'm returning the sum variable after the for loop, because I know the for loop does a job of adding numbers into the sum. So only after I'm done adding everything should I return my final answer. Let's go ahead and just run this first test case, see how we do. Cool, I get 13. Let me bring in these other test cases and make sure it works. Cool, so 13, 12, 7, and 0. Right, so this is good to go. why don't we take it a little slower and actually kind of trace through how this program executes. So really just honing in on the first example. Let's kind of set the stage. So here I have a variable on line 5. I set sum equal to 0. And I'm going to track its current value during like its runtime right next to it in a comment, right? So you see that 0 over here. So let's jump into the for loop here. I set I equal to 0 and I check, is 0 less than numbers.length? And just bear in mind that numbers.length is going to be 3, right? Because there are 3 elements inside of this array. So that's going to be true. And then I grab the element at index I, and I just said I was 0. So I'm going to get the element 3 over here. And so I'm going to take that 3 and I'm going to add it into my sum, but also change that sum. So I do 0 plus equals 3 gives me 3 over here. And now what I do is increment my I. So I was 0, but now it's going to refer to 1. And I check, is 1 less than 3? Because that's still the length of my array, right? That doesn't change. And that's true. So I get to run the code again. So now since I is 1, what's the element at index 1 in this array? That's going to be the element 2. So I take that 2 and I add it into my sum again. That gives me 5. And then I iterate once more. And so I do I++. So that means my I is going to be pointing to 2. That's still less than 3, right? Because 3 is the length of my array. And what I do is take that element from the array, right? So numbers at index 2 is really going to refer to 8, right? Don't forget, if I count my indices, it's 0, 1, and then 2. So I take that 8 and add it into my sum. So 5 plus equals 8 is going to give me a nice 13. Cool. And then technically there's actually one more iteration that we kind of start, right? So I just said that I was equal to 2, right? Because I'm going 0, 1, 2. And now I actually increment it to 3, right? And I check, is 3 less than numbers.length? In other words, is 3 less than 3? And that's false, so I actually exit this loop, right? So I'm done with this for loop, and I just return the sum, which is currently the value 13. And that's why we see it over here. It's a very similar scenario for the other test cases. But look at the very last test case here. It's pretty interesting, right? If I pass in an empty array, what happens here? Well, I set my sum equal to 0. Then I kind of look at my for loop. I set I equal to 0 and I check, hey, is 0 less than numbers.length? In other words, is 0 less than 0? Because the length of the array is 0. That's actually false. So I just get to the code after the for loop and return my sum, which is still 0, right? So nothing fancy over here. So that was a pretty good warm-up problem. So key pattern to take away from this problem is I should be returning the sum after the for loop because I want like the grand total. So if the for loop has a job of adding things into the sum, I want to return my final answer after that little process is done. Let's go ahead to number 2. So here we want to write a stay positive function. So I'll go ahead and create that file really quick. So in this function, what I should do is accept an array of numbers as an argument, just like before, but this time just return an array containing only the positive numbers, right? So look at the first example. I'm given 10, -4, 3, and 6, and I return an array of just the positives. So that means just 10, 3, and 6, right? So I kind of exclude the -4 here. So basically just choosing the positive numbers. Let's go ahead and lay the foundation. Let me create a nice function, which takes in an array. I'll call that array numbers. And what do I want this function to do? Well, it should return an array at the end. So let me kind of set that. So I'm going to begin with an empty array. I'll call this like positives. It's going to start as an empty array, but by the end of the function, it's not going to be an empty array. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill in the last part. Something that I'm a huge fan of doing is if I know I'm going to eventually return the positives array, I can just lay that down. That way I don't forget. So I'm going to return positives, but I should be adding elements into that array. Cool. So I have to think about where do those elements come from? Well, they're really just elements of the original array, but I really just choose the positive ones. So let me just work on grabbing every element of the array. And that can be done with a classic for loop, right? So I'm going to write the very classic for loop, let I equals 0 because it's the first index, go up to but not including numbers.length, and then hit every element along the way. Cool. And I know I can reference the current element by just saying numbers at index I, right? So on the first iteration of this for loop, when I is 0, that means numbers I is going to be 10. Next iteration, after I add 1 to it, right? I is going to be 1, and I check numbers at index 1, which is going to be this -4, and so on. And so this gives us a way to just iterate through every element of the array. Let's just say I took this element and just put it inside of the positives array, right? So the way we learned to do that was just use the push method. So I can do in general array.push. So I'm pushing this element into the array. And after I'm done doing that for every element, I'm going to return positives. So this obviously isn't going to be the full solution, but it's a good stopping point. So let me see what happens here. This should just really copy the contents of the input array to our output array. So I'm still going to have the -4, but then we can always adjust it. So I just get the same array I put in, and I have to think about how can I really bring this function in line with what they're asking for. So they're saying we only want the positive numbers. And so if I only want the positive numbers, don't push everything, only push the number if that number is a positive one. So if that number is greater than 0. So it's using a conditional right within my for loop. Cool. And so notice that I don't really have an else statement here because I don't need one, right? I'm saying, hey, if the number is positive, then put it inside of the array. If it's not positive, then don't do anything, right? Don't push it. So this should be good to go. So I get 10, 3, and 6. And let's go ahead and bring in these other function calls. They should work all the same. So let's keep it going. Let's go ahead and work on the bleep vowels function. So I'll create that file. So I want bleep vowels. And what should I do in this one? Well, I want to write a function. This time it ought to accept a string as an argument. And the function should return a new string where all the vowels are replaced with stars. And I see that vowels are the letters A, E, I, O, U, right? So look at the first example. I have the input string skateboard. Here the vowels would be any character that's among these 5 that kind of designate. That would be the A, the E, the O, and the other A. And we just want to replace those characters with stars, it looks like. So notice the output over here. And so let's go ahead and define our function, lay the foundation. So I'm going to create bleep vowels. And it's going to take in a string. I'll just call it str. So if you look at this description, you're probably wondering, it doesn't really explicitly mention the use of an array. And it's really up to you to decide like what tools to use. So you possibly could use an array to solve this. But maybe not totally directly, right? Because my input's a string, my output's also a string. And so really where the array can be useful here is storing all of these vowels, right? And so what I'll do to start is really just check, hey, let me create a variable. I'll call it vowels, and I'll just group everything together over here, right? So I'm going to create an array of just my vowel characters. So A, E, I, O, U, and so on. Cool, so I have an array of these vowels, and I'm going to use that to really check against the characters of my input string. So let me just work on iterating through characters of my input string. So what I'll do is start a for loop. It's going to be that classic for loop, right? You're going to write this for loop a ton as a programmer. So just iterate through every element of the array. And I know I can reference the current character by saying string at index I. Cool. And let's do something similar to what we did with the last stay positive one. So we're kind of maybe going to ignore the vowels around line 5. I think about what I want the return value to be here, and it should be a string, right? So let me go ahead and initialize that. And a nice thing to initialize that output string as, so I'll call it bleeped. It would be nice for it to be an empty string. And what I'm going to do is concatenate or add characters to this bleeped string over time. By the end, I'm going to return it though, right? So I'll return bleeped. But let's go ahead and properly add characters to it. So what I can do is, I'm iterating through each character on line 9, right? What I can do is take bleeped and add to it this current character I'm iterating through, right? So nothing fancy with like this for loop line itself, right? So when I is equal to 0, right, I'm going to go ahead and check the character at index 0, which would be this S. Next iteration, when I is index 1, I'm going to check the K and so on. And what I'm going to do is take each of those single characters and concatenate them to the bleep string. So let's say we just ran this, and I'll try the first example. Obviously, we're not doing anything with the star yet, so this is really only a partial solution. So I'll run bleep vowels. So I get back skateboard, and it's kind of actually close out the gate. I just need to star the vowels, right? And so I really only want to run line 9 for the characters that are not vowels, right? So here's where I can use another conditional, right? Very similar in pattern to the last stay positive one. So here's what I'll do. I'll create an if else. So I know I want to take one course of action for, let's say, vowels, and I want to take a kind of different course of action for non-vowels. So what I want to express here is maybe like, hey, if the character is a vowel, and then inside of this else statement, I want to check else the char is not a vowel, right? And that will be like my dual logic over here. And so how can I express this condition in a more programmatic way? Well, I have a vowels array, so we'll state that. So I'll say vowels. And the trick here is you could have really just checked if your current character is an element of the vowels array. So I can say vowels dot index of, right, using that cool index of pattern, and I can check my current character. So you've seen this index of method before, right? I'm trying to find the index of my current character within vowels. And I know that it's going to give back an index, which is a number. Recall that if my character is found inside of my vowels array, that means I'm going to get back the actual index of it. And an index is a number 0 or greater, right? Because it's a proper index of an array. And if it's not actually an element of the vowels array, that is, if my character is not an element of the vowels array, then I get back -1. So I'll just go ahead and check, hey, if the index I get back from this little expression, vowels.index of character, if that is greater than -1, then it must mean that it is found in the vowels array. So it must be a vowel. And so this is really checking if my character is a vowel, then what I want to do is take my bleep string and add to it a star, right? Because I'm kind of substituting vowels for stars. And then otherwise, it's not a vowel, and you're okay to just add the original character to that. Cool, so this is looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and test our first example. All right, and there we are censoring the vowels in the word skateboard. So although this code may be understandable, right, we can see that, hey, string at index I just refers to the current character of the string. I always like to create variables, kind of label what I'm doing. That way I don't have to do too many like mental gymnastics in my mind. So I'm going to take this expression, and something that speaks more closely for me is just calling that a character. Then I'll just go ahead and check, hey, is that character inside of the vowels array, right? I can just always refer to it as the character, right? So on the first iteration, when I is 0, that means char is going to be the S. When I is index 1, that means char is going to be K, and so on. So let me run this code. Nice, and let's go ahead and run all of the test cases. Nice, and this code is totally working. So what I want you to take away from this bleep vowels problem is kind of how we built it up, right? So I'm a huge fan of like setting variables that I'll need at the start. And if I'm going to have to touch every character of like some input, like a string or an array, probably going to need to iterate through it. And then I'll add a conditional like to that, right? So I really do my code in layers. That way I can build it up and make sure it works as I go. What I don't want to do is like write a ton of code and then, test it all at the very end, right? So try to build it up in pieces. So let's keep it rolling. And we'll work on this one, and this is going to be filter long words. And so in this function, what we should do is take in an array of some strings and return a new array containing only the strings that are less than 5 characters long. So I have this nice array of some words, and I return this array of words. Notice that I'm excluding things like retro and heirloom because they're not less than 5 characters long. Cool. Let's give this a go. It should be a pretty easy problem, very familiar to the other ones we've done. So let me create my function. It's going to take in an array of words. And yeah, let's start to lay the foundation. So I'll start by thinking about what type of data I want to return. I want to return an array over here. So let me go ahead and create that. I'll call it my chosen words. So I have that initial variable, and I know I'm going to return that thing by the end. So the words that I'm going to return should really come from my input array, which is words. So let me iterate through my input array with a classic for loop. Now that I'm starting to iterate through my words array, what I want to do is take every word and just maybe push it into my chosen words. All right, so I'll go ahead and do chosen words dot push that thing. And this will just take every original word and copy it basically into my chosen words array. Obviously, if I just run this code as it is, I'm going to get too many elements because I'm not avoiding the long words right now. So I'll give it a go. Do a quick spot check. So I basically have all of the elements I need with some extras. So I want to avoid adding the long words into the array. Right? In other words, I only want to push the word into the array if it has a certain length. So I'll go ahead and check, hey, if the element that I'm iterating through, the word, if it is less than 5 characters long, so I'll check if the length of it is strictly less than 5, what I'll do is push it into the array. Notice the detail here. I don't want to just check if like word at index I is less than 5, because that doesn't make any sense, right? On the first iteration, if I is equal to 0, that means word at index 0 is going to be kale. I can't check literally if like kale is less than 5, right? That doesn't make any sense. What you really want to do is check if the length of that is less than 5. So that's why I apply .length to that expression. Cool, so check if its length is less than 5. If it is, then go ahead and push it. So let's go ahead and run this. Nice, I get kale cat axe, nice, and then pour and pick. Cool. Maybe what I'll just do here for fun is maybe just show you how you can possibly refactor your code. Be nice if we can call this words at index I, maybe just a single word. And then I can create a variable called word, and that should be derived from words at index I. And maybe at this point in our programming careers, we probably don't see like the huge value of creating like intermediate variables like that. But trust me, as you get further along and as your code gets way longer, as your functions get bigger, it's really nice to be able to refer to your data in a very like simple and almost like self-expressive way, right? So I know when I grab a single element out of the words array, I get one word, right? So I really try to follow like the singular and plural forms of my variables, right? You'll notice that like for the most part, most like arrays I create are in the plural. And then when I grab an element, if I do decide to create a single variable for one element, I'll name it in the singular, right? That way I don't confuse myself. So let's go ahead and move to the numOdds function. So I'll create this file. And what I want to do in this one is write a function that takes in an array of numbers, but go ahead and return a count of the number of odd elements in the array. So let's take a look at the first example here. So I have this array of numbers, and we should return the number 3 because there are 3 odd numbers in this array. So the odds would be 7, 5, and 9, and those are 3 numbers altogether, right? I don't count 4 and 2 because those are even numbers. And it's very similar for all the examples here. Maybe noting the last example, 140 and 4, they're all even numbers, so the count of odds is 0, right? Let's go ahead and define this function. And of course, this function will take in an array of numbers. And what I want to do is, this time we're just return a count, right? So there's no like return array to set up here, but I do want a counter. So I'll just say maybe like let count. It's gonna begin at 0. And basically, the logic there is saying, before I even look at any numbers in the array, I have a count of 0, right? Think about how you count things. And so from this point, what I should do is look at every element of the array. So that's going to just be a classic for loop, right? Huge theme in this problem set. So iterate all the way through the numbers array. So I go from I equals 0 all the way up to, but not including numbers.length. And I do I++. Make sure when you iterate with a classic for loop, you start at index 0. And you iterate up to but not including numbers.length, right? So if we do a quick sanity check, if I think about this array, right, it has 5 elements inside. The last index, though, has index 4, right? Because my first index is 0. So I go 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And that's why I should iterate strictly less than numbers.length, because the length of the array is really 5, right? So the last iteration would give me I equals 4. Notice I have like square brackets here. Let me fix that. That will definitely not run. And what I want to do is take my current element. So I know I can always refer to that by just saying basically array at index I. And I want to basically count it if it happens to be in odd quantity. So I can check is the current element in odd one? So to check, even or odd, what you can do is use a nice modulo operator, right? So I can check, hey, if I divide the element by 2 and it has a remainder of 1, that means that the number must be an odd. Right? And if that statement is true, then what I want to do is take that element and go ahead and really consider it into my count, right? So what I don't want to do is like count.push. You kind of have the right idea if you're doing count.push, but I need to adjust it for like the correct data type, right? So I don't want to return an array. I want to return just like the total count. Right now, my count variable is a number. I can't do number.push, right? Push is only for arrays. So what I want to do instead is, if my number is odd, then add 1 to my count, because I just saw an odd number. So I'll do count plus equals 1. Otherwise, the element's even. I don't want to do anything, right? Basically, don't add anything into the count. And I want to return my final count after my for loop is done running. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. Nice, and there's our solution for numOdds. Let's go ahead and trace through this one a little bit. So let's say we're honing in on just the first example. So we know we begin our count variable as 0, and the numbers array is referring to this array. My first iteration, numbers at index I, is going to refer to the element 4. So I check what is 4 mod 2, that's going to be 0, right? Because when I divide 4 by 2, there is no remainder. Is 0 equal to 1? That statement's going to be false, so I don't add 1 into my count. So my count stays at 0, but I'm on to the next iteration, right? So now I'm referring to this element over here, and I check, is 7 mod 2 equal to 1? That's correct, right? Because if I divide 7 by 2, I have a remainder of 1. 1 is equal to 1, and so I'm allowed to increment my count, right? So I have 1 over here. Next iteration, numbers at index I is going to refer to 2. it's not going to be an odd number, right? So I don't add into my count. I get to 5, it is going to be an odd number, so I increment my count by 1. And finally, last iteration, numbers at I is going to refer to 9. It is not divisible by 2, so I get a remainder of 1, and I add 1 into my count as well, right? So by the end, I've counted all 3 of these odd numbers, right? The 7, the 5, and the 9. And then for the even numbers, I did not increment, right, to my count. Nice, and that's our solution to our num_odds problem. Let's go ahead and do this strings to lengths problem. So in this problem, what I want to do is write a function that takes in an array of strings and returns a new array containing the lengths of all of the elements. So looking at the first example over here, we have an input array. And the first thing I'll notice is I should have the same number of elements, right? So my input array is length 4 in this first example. My output is also length 4. In the second example, my input array has length 3. My output array also has length 3, right? And then from there, how do I actually decide what the actual elements are inside of my output array? You just look at the length of the original element, right? So belly has 5 characters, right? Echo has 4 characters, and at the end, pickled has exactly 7 characters. So this is just going to be a nice little exercise to practice, dealing with arrays. So let's write our function. And I know that I want to return an array in the output, so I'll go ahead and lay that foundation. So I'll call it just lengths. Make sure you spell it wrong. And I'll return that. And obviously I want to fill up that lengths array. So what I need to do is look at every element of the input array. So I'll iterate through words, right? So let I equal 0, I is less than words dot length, and of course I++. And now that I'm iterating through every word, I just want to take the length of that word and push it into the lengths array. So nothing fancy here, just do lengths dot push, and I'll write the element, which can be referred to as words at index I, right? So words at index I dot length over here. Cool, so a little multi-part expression. I do remember how things evaluate over here though. So let's kind of step through it. Let's say on the first iteration, we know that I is going to be 0. And so that means when I get words at index 0, that's going to refer to belly in this first example. So I have the string belly over here. And you know that if I do belly.length, that evaluates to 5. And what I do is just take my 5 and push it into the array. And that follows a very similar pattern for the other iterations over here, right? So bear in mind, what we learned about when we talked about expressions in JavaScript and how they evaluate piece by piece. So this is the original. Let's go ahead and run this code. So I want to be running string to length. Nice, so I get 5, 4, 5, 7, correct, and 2, 3, 8. Nice. So let's finally work on the last problem here. We want to write this divisors function. And so in this one, what we want to do is write a function. It should take in a single number as an argument, but return an array. So that's pretty interesting. And what should that array contain as elements? Well, it should contain all of the positive numbers that can divide into our original argument. So look at the first example. I have 15. And its output contains the element 1, 3, 5, and 15. Basically, these 4 numbers are exactly all the positive numbers that are able to go into or divide into 15, right? So basically I'm saying, hey, 15 is divisible by 1, and 3, and 5, and 15, right? Likewise for these other examples here. So for all matters like of divisibility, the operator that should come to mind is definitely modulo. So I'll just bear that in the back of my mind. But for now, let me lay out my initial function definition. So this function should take in just an input number as an argument. I'll just call it n. Right? And what I want to return is an array. So let me set that up. I'll create a variable called numbers. It's going to be an array. I know I should be returning it by the very end. But by the end, it should contain some elements, right? And so how do I generate these elements? Well, what I want to do is really just find the positive numbers that divide into my input n. Right? They give us some hints here, right? You should only be considering positive numbers. And so let me just start iterating through some positive numbers. So I'll iterate. I know the first positive number is just 1. It's also like the first possible divisor. It's probably going to divide most numbers that we have as our input. And what I'll do is iterate up to and including my number n, my input. So this is pretty interesting, right? Don't forget that we can write for loops that just iterate through numbers, right? Those are really like the first kinds of for loops you learned, right? So it's not technically iterating through an array, right? So if I'm running this first example where n is 15, this for loop just iterates from 1 up to and including 15. And that's good because those are basically like the possible divisors into 15, but I need to narrow them down, right? So let's say for now, I just console.log I. And again, please don't confuse yourself. I is already a number, so I'm just gonna print out that number, right? It's not technically an index in this example, so I'm not gonna use it to access any array. So let's go ahead and run this baseline. So I should just be seeing numbers from 1 to 15, right? And there it is, right? 1 all the way up to 15. Notice that the empty array that's being returned at the end is just because I have my function returning the empty array, and I'm not pushing any elements to it yet. And so what I want to do is really only consider the number I if it's able to divide n. And so what I want to do is check if my original argument n, if that's divisible by my current number I'm iterating through I, right? So if n is divisible by I, then the remainder, when I divide it, should be 0. Cool, right? So this is just the classic divisibility pattern, right? So if I just move this console.log, kind of testing it as I go, this should now just print out the numbers that divide into 15, right? 1, 3, 5, and 15. And basically the last step here is just take that number and push it into your numbers array, right? So numbers.push element I. Cool, and only after I'm done iterating through all possible divisors of n should I return my numbers array. So let's try all these examples. So let's give this a go. And if I do a quick check, yeah, these are all correct. Don't worry about this weird line break that for some reason Node adds. It's really the same array elements as this, right? So this is good to go. So bear in mind, as we're writing code that deals with arrays, it's not going to be the case that like every for loop is going to explicitly iterate through an array, right? So if I want to be like very, very specific, this for loop does not iterate through an array. It just iterates from I equals 1 up to our input argument, right? Now where the array comes into play is where I store those numbers I, right? I'm basically only pushing the numbers that are divisible into n. So that wraps up the walkthrough for this set. We're going to be practicing arrays a lot more in the next few videos.